So thank you to those people who won't. Mike will be speaking, the others won't, but they've done a lot of work to both put the budget together and the presentation. So thank you. This is our presentation map for today. We're going to start with a very brief overview of the department, and then we're going to focus a little deeper on a couple of issues that are bigger issues for the department this year. Our streets infrastructure, the facilities infrastructure, and then the budget impacts of this record-breaking drought. We will follow that with highlights of P3s and projects that the department is working on, and then we will go through proposed changes from the 2-year financial plan. Presenting today's budget are the division managers for each of the 7 divisions in Public Works, with the exception of Fleet. Our fleet manager, Gary Horwald, is off at an important wedding, his daughter's. And so Sam Harmon, our fleet supervisor, will be filling in for Gary. We've got Jim Dewey, the streets operation and infrastructure manager, presenting the streets operations budget. Joshua Hagmark, water resources manager, on the water and wastewater fund budgets. Brian DeMoore, the city engineer, talking about the engineering program. Mike Wiltshire, facilities and energy manager, who will present that portion of the budget. Rob Dayton, transportation planning and parking manager, will go over those programs. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with Michael Pease, who will talk about changes from the 2-year financial plan. The Public Works mission is to provide our community with a sustainable foundation to thrive by delivering quality services and public infrastructure through efficient and fiscally responsible practices, something we really strive hard to achieve. We recognize that we touch everybody's life every day, and we try and make it as seamless as possible. The department is the largest in the city, with almost 300 employees. We have 17 managers, 33 supervisors, almost 250 general employees, and not mentioned here, but we have a number of hourly employees as well. We're not proposing any changes in FTEs with this budget, but I did want to acknowledge that earlier this calendar year, we did add 2 positions to manage the police station building project. We have 35 performance-based budget programs, and we will be touching on the highlights of those later in this presentation. This is a snapshot of the revenues by fund, and you can see that the largest revenues correspond to those areas of the department with the most infrastructure. Our water, streets, and wastewater funds are our largest, with facilities and downtown parking both at almost $10 million as well. But you can see that they correspond to the areas of responsibility for maintenance of those large infrastructures. And then expenditures, not surprisingly, are similarly divided. You will see that our expenditures exceed revenues by about $10 million, and that is a planned use of reserves in several programs. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Dewey.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Bjork. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. I'm Jim Dewey. I'm the Streets Operations and Infrastructure Manager. So I'll be here to introduce the next section of our presentation, and that's focusing on managing our resources with an emphasis on our 3 E's: effectiveness, efficiency, and execution. So kind of an overview of that particular section. We're going to be talking about how the addition of funds from Measure C are fundamentally shifting the way that we're doing work, the way that our outlook looks, and the way that we're planning our work. And this is related to all the capital funding that we're getting for the streets and related infrastructure and for facilities infrastructure. And we'll also be talking about how the stabilizing of our water resources has affected our drought planning and our continued response to the existing drought. So to begin with, we'll talk about streets, operations, and infrastructure. And Brian DeMoore, our city engineer, is here to help me present this. First of all, Streets Operations and Infrastructure's mission is to safely operate and maintain over 250 miles of roadway and its related infrastructure. We have 10 operating programs, and so we maintain pavement, sidewalks, storm drains, traffic signals, and other infrastructure. We also provide for traffic engineering services, street sweeping, and graffiti abatement. We fund the Streets Capital Program, streetlight maintenance, transportation planning, street tree and median maintenance, and a host of other services. So normally when we present our budget presentation, we present the highlights of our programs, and this year we're going to deviate a little bit from that. We really want to tell the story about how the additional funding from Measure C and also the additional gas tax that we got from SB1 is contributing to the opportunities that we have to maintain our infrastructure. So this is a comparison between FY17, where we were before Measure C came in, and also SB1. And so this is revenue for all of our streets operations and capital, $12.5 million. And now we're looking at a whole different scenario. We have $32.2 million roughly. And virtually all of that additional revenue is going to be spent on capital and capital maintenance. So along with that, our outlook has also changed. In FY17, we were looking at a lot of declining road conditions. All of our infrastructure was on the decline. And we really had very limited options as to what we can do about that. And we also saw increasing costs because our roadways were seeing more and more damage, and then the cost of that improvement cost even more to fix. And in FY19, or our outlook today, we're able to fund a comprehensive maintenance program. So we're looking at reinvesting in all of our infrastructure. And we have a lot more options now because we can choose from a host of roads that we want to improve, and also many different types of treatments to match the treatment with the condition of the road. Also, we're releasing larger contracts, so we're seeing better economies of scale.
So my name is Brian Demore, City Engineer. Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to jump in a few times just to kind of reiterate some of the points that Mr. Dewey's been making. Engineering supports the operations of our capital infrastructure through the deployment of funds for maintenance and improvements. In the area of streets, capital improvements have relied extensively on grant funds, while the cost for capital maintenance is paid primarily by non-grant funds. In the recent past, our non-grant funding for maintenance has been so limited that we've really been unable to have a planned or a programmed approach to maintaining our assets. It's been much more reactionary. So for pavement maintenance, we've had a small planned pavement maintenance program, but we're only able to touch about 0.5% to maybe, on a good year, 1% of our city streets. So that would tell you that we're looking at a 100 to 200 year cycle, which is just not sustainable, and that's why we were seeing our declining PCI. Other streets-related assets, such as storm drains, they were just run to failure. So we had a small amount of funds programmed, and as they failed, we would fix them, but there wasn't enough money to go and assess and prioritize and proactively get ahead of those untimely and disruptive repairs. With Measure C, we're now able to invest in that and to begin to get ahead of those unplanned emergencies.
This slide shows the evolution of our planning over time. And in FY17, really, because we were so short on resources, we focused on triage primarily. We tried to keep our arterials, or the most used roads, in the best possible condition that we could, but we were always faced with those shifting priorities. You know, we always had to address the immediate emergencies that were before us, and that doesn't lead to a good preventive maintenance program. In FY18, we began receiving some of the SB1 funds, the gas tax funds, and some Measure C funds also. So we had a capital program of about $4 million. With that, we had a very focused scope of projects where we were going to concentrate on some very high priority repairs I'll talk about in a little bit. But we also began to see better unit pricing and better project pricing. Just because of the size of the project. We haven't let a contract like that out for pavement maintenance in quite a while. Beginning in FY19, for the next 5 years, we're going to be focusing on begin to eliminate the deferred maintenance backlog that we have. We'll also be focusing on developing a new baseline for our pavement condition. Our goal is to have a pavement condition on average of 70, which would be in the good category. Right now it's at 58 or at risk on average. We'll also be putting in a lot of ADA access ramps during this time, and we'll continue to leverage grant funds for our larger capital projects like bridge replacements. Into the future, it's going to take us a long time to get through our deferred maintenance backlog, but we're going to do that. But along with that, we need to maintain the things that we've already done. Whenever we've overlaid a street, we need to also provide surface treatments of that to keep its longevity up. And we'll continue planning that out and completing that as a complete maintenance program. We'll also be focusing on long-term coordination with other utilities that are in the right-of-way, both the city's utilities and the public utilities, to try to eliminate unnecessary trenching. The last thing that we want is to trench into a newly paved road. And we'll continue our grant leveraging efforts. So this is the kind of things that we see right now in the roadway and in the public right-of-way. We have a lot of trenches that are poorly compacted and aren't fixed very well. And sometimes, you know, when a utility comes in and repairs a trench, it looks fine at the time, and then 2 years down the road, it looks like that. It's sunken down, it creates problems. We also have a lot of cracking, which is really due to stresses to the pavement due to either expansion and contraction or just traffic. And then we have the third picture, what we call alligatoring. That really is a failure of the pavement system as well as the base underneath it. So all of that asphalt has to come out, and we need to perform what we call a deep lift repair on that. And then we have a lot of sidewalks throughout the city, but we have a lot of street trees too, and street trees are pretty amazing at being able to uplift and destroy sidewalks. So it's a continuous effort. Of course, we love our street trees. The last picture is a 1960s vintage storm drain, and this is a corrugated metal pipe, and virtually all of that vintage of pipe looks similar to this. I mean, it's pretty much rusted out on the bottom, so all of those culverts need to be replaced. And of course, these efforts are, and our plans will replace them. This table shows the breakdown of our pavement condition index by category. And as you can see, about 30% of our streets are in good or excellent condition, and about 70% are at risk or below. And so our effort is to bring our average up into the good and excellent category. So looking at our plan of action, this is where our 3 E's come in. We want to focus on effectiveness. We want to have great results. We want nice, smooth, and safe roads. And we want to match whatever pavement treatment that we have that best matches the existing condition of the road so we can do it efficiently. We also want to have better coordination to try to reduce trenching in newly paved roads. And we want to minimize the disruption to the community through better planning and scheduling. In terms of efficiency, I'll be talking about a little bit more about all these subjects. But some of the things that we're seeing, as I said, is that contractors are interested in our work, and so we have more competition, and that helps to drive our pricing lower. We also have better economies of scale. We're releasing larger projects and we're seeing better unit costs. We also are seeing mobilization efficiency, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides too. But in terms of execution, we want to get as many of our projects out as quickly as possible. So we're going to move our planning efforts up sooner so that we can take advantage of the prime construction months of the summer season before the wet season comes into play. So better coordination. Like I mentioned before, the worst thing or the most depressing thing that can happen, I suppose if you look at it like that, is when you've repaved a road that somebody cuts a trench into it. And sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes we have emergencies. But through better coordination, we can try to eliminate as much of that as we possibly can. And this is really about working on a long-term basis, not only with our own utilities, with wastewater collections and water distribution, but with also the public utilities, SoCalGas, Southern California Edison, Cox, and so forth.
So as city engineer, I have, I would say, a unique perspective on this coordination that is going on. As our two programs in engineering services program, they're responsible for the city's capital program, or primarily the public works capital program. And on the land development engineering side, they are responsible for the private work. So I kind of say that we're the gatekeepers of the construction activity within the right-of-way. So I'm witnessing a lot of coordination that's happening between internal programs, but also externally. There's far more work happening in the right-of-way now than I've seen in my 11 years here. The city's street program is already beginning to take off with Measure C, but we also know that the water main program the last couple of years has ramped up, and I think will continue to ramp up. Wastewater repair and rehab, that's been a elevated program over the last several years. So on top of that, the utility work is happening all over town all the time, and I think you don't have to walk more than 2 or 3 blocks away from City Hall on any given day, and you're going to bump into construction work. So as the gatekeepers of that, we're working very hard to coordinate that, to have good systems in place for sharing of information, and to have frequent interaction with people either internally or externally with the utility companies, so that at least we know what's planned. The unplanned work is what's hard, but when you have the funding to put a plan together, it's certainly much easier. And fortunately, we're seeing the city and some of the utility companies are investing in this with Edison. So to give that example, we know they're about to do a major effort on Anacapa Street. So we don't really want to touch that street yet until they're done and out of there. So you'll see the streets crews, they did a patch there, but the whole street really needs to be touched. We're waiting for Edison to finish, and then we'll go out there and do that. That's just an example of some of the coordination.
Rob Dayton, Transportation Planning and Parking Manager. Another item in the interest of better coordination and with Measure C is that State Street, now that we have the ambassadors program and they're on the street every single day and taking note of all the things that may need to be fixed or are in disrepair, the better coordination strategy is to have downtown parking manage those projects and spend that money so that we can in real time begin to address these issues on our highest quality corridor in our business district. So that means that where we've deferred maintenance on the bricks in the past, where there's undulations in the bricks, or some of the other features, the lighting, the other furniture that's on the street, the high quality, the drinking fountains, the trash cans, everything will begin to address those issues and the maintenance issues that has been deferred.
And Mr. Dayton, for the benefit of the public, the ambassadors are in the red shirts. So when they see those folks on the street, they're helping with our negative street behavior, but also, as you said, public works infrastructure note taking. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Council, I'm Mike Wiltshire, the Facilities and Energy Manager. Streetlights are a perfect example where we take a collaborative approach. They're an asset that is in the public right-of-way. They're ultimately funded by the streets program, but the Facilities Division has the expertise, staff, and equipment to maintain and renew these assets, which is what we do. A couple areas of focus with streetlights going on now is we just wrapped up a large LED upgrade. And so first and foremost, huge energy savings there, which is fantastic. Getting a lot of reports of improved lighting quality. And what that means when I say the LED upgrade is the city owns about half of our street lights. So this is kind of in the realm of 1,000 lights. One of the other big projects going forward is we have 400 or 500 legacy streetlights that are high voltage, 6.6 amp circuits. And these need to be upgraded over time. That could involve everything from trenching, replacing new conduit. And so that's something that we're going to work with streets directly on over the years to come to get those up to the point where they can be converted to LED, and they're a lot safer wiring underground. These are kind of older, aging systems. And so we look to work with streets long term, collaboratively on making sure that this is done correctly.
Moving on to efficiencies, with the addition of the funds that we're receiving from Measure C and SB1. Like I said before, we're releasing larger contracts. That's attracting more contractors and providing better competition. We're also seeing better economies of scale, too, even with our first project that we rolled out at $4 million. So we're expecting good things there. Another thing that we're seeing is mobilization efficiency. The contractor is not only responsible for the asphalt pavement work, but is also responsible for the concrete work, so the replacement of sidewalks, curb and gutter, the installation of access ramps, and so forth. And what this does is it saves money as far as mobilizing one contractor as opposed to two. And also it eliminates a lot of the coordination that needs to happen between two contractors to pull this off. So there are efficiency savings in that. Another thing that we're doing is that we're bidding with standard details, like standard details for access ramps, for instance. And that allows contractors to be able to bid and with very low risk. They're bidding on things that are very much known. And this also helps us to bring down the unit pricing on things like access ramps. And we also realize efficiency when we use our streets crews to perform the capital work. I've already talked about the use of standard details. Well, sometimes we encounter issues where an access ramp is not a standard detail. And in that case, our streets crews are very adept at taking care of that work, so we don't generate a change order and extra costs from the contractor to do it. So we can assign that to our streets crews. Also, ahead of production paving, the streets crews can do the deep lift repairs, which can save money. And also, they do their own production paving too, which is a real asset to the city.
An assortment of grant programs has allowed us to replace critical infrastructure such as bridges through the Federal Highway Bridge Program, to implement important safety measures through the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and to install or improve infrastructure for bicyclists and pedestrians through the Active Transportation Program. These important grant programs allow us to focus our non-grant funding on capital maintenance. However, because many of these grant programs require a city match, there's often been this dilemma about going after grant projects knowing that there's a match and knowing that that match is taken away from funding that would otherwise go to capital maintenance. One example would be the Coda Street Bridge, which is actually pictured there on the left. That was about a $9.5 million project. The city had to pay about $1 million of its own dollars to match that. So a great opportunity to replace a key piece of infrastructure, but that $1 million was $1 million less for pavement maintenance or some other capital maintenance program. So as a result, we've had bridges and various other improvements going up around town, but around the corner, the streets continue to be in a pretty rough state because there weren't any grant funds available to go after that. So that dilemma has always been in play with the grant program. With Measure C, I think staff can continue to be aggressive going after these grants, trying to use as little city match as possible, but with a little bit less worry about not being able to adequately maintain the streets infrastructure.
And then lastly, our execution. So our goal is to deliver projects as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Already the streets crews have repaid our portion of Gibraltar Road. If you haven't seen that, I know the bicyclists appreciate it. This summer, we will also be repaving Bath Street and Castillo Street from Carrillo to Victoria. And we'll be completing some much needed repairs on Upper State Street right around the 101 overpass. Another thing that we're going to start this summer is the planning for the repaving and recontouring of the Mission Street corridor. So that's from 101 all the way down Mission Street, where it connects eventually to Los Olivos and in front of the Mission. And so our FY19 projects are going to include a lot of different options on a lot of different streets. So we're going to be overlaying, we're going to be providing slurry seal, possibly some cape seal, microfinishing, and a lot of different treatments depending on whatever the conditions of the roadways are. So you're going to see a lot of different work, and we're going to try to spread that work across all the geographic areas of the city to minimize the impact that it has on the community, and also to provide some fairness in the distribution of the work. And with that, we'll take your questions.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Dewey, a few years back we invested in some software, I think it was an AAS program or whatever it was, that we could coordinate and schedule for public consumption, for public awareness about when these things were happening. So if I am either a business owner or a member of the DO or the chamber and I want to know what's going on with certain streets at certain times, is that being utilized, and is that coordinated in a way that I could find out when, excuse me, when you're going to be on my street?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, that's a good question. We have a program called Excella, and it's used for permitting, both at community development and in public works. And with that program, it has the ability, also it has a mapping component that allows us to identify all of the work that's happening in the public right-of-way. It isn't available for public consumption yet, but we're going to use that program to identify everything that's happening in the right-of-way and release regular updates publicly through our website for that.
Well, I know that in the past, sometimes when there's utility work going on that is scheduled, that there has been some frustration amongst people that have businesses in the downtown that they weren't able to find out until the barricades went up that a project was coming up. And I know that with these major road work things that we're planning, and I know you've got somewhat of a schedule, I'm just wondering how much information can be disseminated ahead of time so that people can make, plans for delivery, plans for employees, plans for customers, all those kinds of things that would make your phone ring less.
Sure. We do need to provide noticing to the public before we do these things, and we're going to try to coordinate this outreach effort so that it corresponds with the noticing that we have. And so it's something that we're still working on, and it's something that we would like to get in place right away. We're working on it right now, and so we hope that maybe later this summer that it'll be online, but definitely soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Did you consider bond financing for the streets program now that we have the Measure C revenue source?
Councilmember Hart, we have talked about it, we've thought about it, and right now with the level of funding that we're getting, we have more than enough work to do. So it's still an option, but right now we haven't made any action towards bonding.
Well, I'd like to think about that, and actually more than think about that, and I'd like to do that because I do think that I've been here long enough to where I was on the council when there was a 7-year paving cycle that was funded, and then that has drifted away, and we're to where we are now. And now we have this new infusion of money, and I'm concerned that as time goes on, other pressing priorities will intrude on the plan that you have today to meet all these promises, and that I'd like to see that front loaded with debt that ensures that that actually happens, at least for 10 years or so, to ensure that this doesn't get diverted by other council priorities over time. And I think it makes a ton of sense. There is so much deferred work. What I'm sensing in your answer is that there's a limited number of staff to manage a program like that, and that I can understand that, and that has to be talked about. But that could be supported with consultants and additional outside assistance too. So there's ways to solve that problem. But and I'm wondering when we're going to have those kind of conversations. Is this additional development of this plan coming? Is this the plan? Mr. Casey, you look like you're ready to jump in.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart. Next week when we talk about Measure C, actually tomorrow at the Finance Committee, and then next, or maybe in a couple weeks with the full council, Measure C, that's a good time to kind of look at all the different priorities for funding. At this point, this is staff's recommendation about how we're proceeding, but if council wants us to pursue a different approach, happy to look at it.
So you don't have any maps right now that would tell me, in the next 10 years where you're going to get on addressing the backlog of street maintenance?
Well, right now we have a comprehensive map that shows everything. So we're putting it into priority. So we're planning our effort for the next 5 years and then the subsequent 5 years after that. But we have the total of where our roads are right now, as far as where the roads are and what needs to be repaired. So we know what's there.
Well, we know 70% of the roads need a lot of work. So beyond that, refining it to, over the next 10 years, what percentages of those roads are going to be addressed? That's the kind of level of detail that I'm looking for. And this may not be the right time. I don't know if those tomorrow at the Finance Committee or that other Measure C presentation you were planning to give that kind of level of detail. But that's what I'm looking for, is a real concrete, what can people kind of expect in their neighborhood over the next 10 years level of planning effort.
Yeah, we are developing that plan right now, so you're not going to see that tomorrow, but it is in the works.
When is that plan going to be done?
Probably over the next 3 months.
Okay. And is there a decision point that the council has in relation to that plan, or is that just the plan?
Well, it's... did you want to add something, Mr. DeMore?
Yeah, I was just going to add that with the CIP, that'll be an opportunity to look not just at paving, but at all of the needs throughout the city and prioritize. That's a 6-year plan, so not 10 like you mentioned, but I think it gets us out there a ways and into a more regular cycle that we'd like to be in with the pavement maintenance.
Okay. And then the key thing that you mentioned was the integration of the ADA access ramps into the street work. What about sidewalks into that same thing? Are those all together, or is those different things with different approaches?
They actually are different things with different approaches. Of course, the ADA access ramps are going to be triggered with overlays, so they have their own trigger. But they are separate programs, and they will be a lot of coordination, when the contractor's in geographic locations. But the replacement of sidewalk is a different effort.
Is that integrated into the plan that you're talking about, or is that a separate plan?
It's it's all integrated into the plan, but it would be a separate plan.
Okay. And then would street trees be part of that as well, too? What I'm looking at is a complete street approach, making sure that we get into a neighborhood and we do the ADA ramps, we do the street, we do the sidewalk, we do the street trees, get it all done. But I don't know if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, the street tree work has to be coordinated with parks. And so before we tear out sidewalks or replace curb and gutter, we have to have parks come in and give us direction in how we can best manage the trees in order to keep them healthy.
Okay. And then as far as the State Street ambassadors being the canaries in the coal mine, giving you information about what needs to be done on State Street, how is that systematically done? Do they have a clipboard that has a list of the things that they do? How does it actually work?
That's correct, Councilmember Hart. They are documenting nearly everything that they're doing on the street, and we're working on a database to track all our accounts of, for instance, people on the street who are commonly maybe homeless, their names, what's going on, what are the status of certain undulations in the sidewalk. We're building a database so we really know the street really well about everything that's going on, what's going on with businesses. We have business contacts. All that's being logged.
Mm-hmm. And then how does the work get done? Like how long has that been going on? What should I be seeing happening on the street? How long is it going to take for things to change from what it was before to what it is now? Say I'm walking on the street in the morning, like I do, and I notice things. How soon will the polishing of the drinking fountains happen, or the fixing of the drinking fountains, or those kinds of things?
So this budget has $250,000 in it for Measure C, and it's under the line item. I think it's called Business Corridors. So it's intended to be shared amongst corridors, but its first aim is State Street. So with that money, we are preparing, like for instance, initially we're working on a brick rehab program to address the areas up and down the street, just come down the street and address every single issue. And then we will also be doing spot treatments. So you should be seeing things happening on the street pretty soon. Probably not for summer, but in the fall you should be seeing contractors out there repairing the bricks, and you should see some fine tuning the drinking, that type of thing happening. It's not going to all happen in the first year, and then there might be other interests that the council have and other business corridors that we end up sharing some of the money. So we'll have to play that one by ear, but it's our intention to move forward aggressively with those maintenance.
And the rate of investment in that is determined by the annual revenues. So a bonding strategy could accelerate that.
It could. We'll come up with a sum total of what it's going to cost of all the issues, and to understand the full magnitude of it.
And when would that approximately be done, that analysis of the extent of the investment that you need to make?
I would say early fall.
Okay, so everything is about 3 months-ish away for all of these things we're talking about. So by September-ish, all these things are ready. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Friedman?
I just had a question in regards to, we have a lot of contracts out there. They're larger contracts, and how are we on hiring local contractors? Are most of them from out of the area? I know we have to do the competitive bidding, but do we have local contractors that are doing a lot of this work, or are they from out of the area?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, the contractors are both local and they're also located nearby. Some of them are larger firms like Granite Construction that have offices in various places throughout the state. So we don't limit it to locals, but we tend to attract people that are fairly close.
Mr. Dominguez?
So I have a few questions. One, I appreciate the report and the new P3s that are added into the budget. One of the questions I have is, I noticed it seemed like engineering's budget or the mid-cycle adjustment was $400,000, and can you explain what that was for?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we're actually going to, if we can go back to the map on one of the earlier slides, Michael Pease is going to be presenting overview of the budget for the department later on. I think that would be the appropriate time to, if you don't mind saving that question. He'll be up later.
So this first part was just related to streets and engineering related to streets?
So the first part, talking about streets with Measure C, and then I know Josh is going to come up and talk about the water supply situation. So we're going to hit on a couple of those things early, and then we're going to get into P3s and then budget. So that
okay.
First,
I'll save my questions to the end, unless anyone was going to leave that I should ask about now. Everyone's
I'll
going to
be
stay.
here till 5:30.
I'll save all these to the end.
Okay, so, sounds good. I'm just happy about the revenue source. And I hear, Mr. Casey, like there's some plan to undo SB1, so someone wants to is it repeal the gasoline tax revenue, and it's doing such good things for our residents. Is that right?
Yeah, I can let the Public Works staff talk about the dollar amounts that are coming in through SB1, but statewide there is a signature gathering campaign to have a repeal effort on this November's ballot. I'm not sure it has qualified yet, but Public Works could probably clarify what has qualified. And you could clarify how much we expect to be getting SB1 money if it remains in place.
Right now we're receiving about 1.6 million a year from SB1, so losing that would have a significant impact on our capital maintenance program.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dewey. So you're on to facilities and energy management now? Very good, Mr. Wiltshire.
Madam Mayor, Council. Yeah, I'll take the torch and speak a little bit about the facilities budget and more with a focus on how Measure C and new funding will affect our operations going forward. The Facilities and Energy Management Division is a group of 37 people and 6 operating programs. I won't go into detail with the programs, but our core mission is really to maintain and renew our city facilities, our buildings. As mentioned by Jim, historically we present these programs kind of program by program, but we're going to focus a little bit more on Measure C and how that's going to affect us going forward. This is a quick overlook of the facilities budget. The main objective here is to kind of show how Measure C fits into our overall picture. Our total budget with Measure C is about $9.5 million. And on the lower right corner is kind of a breakdown of our direct capital spending. Inherently, we're a pretty operationally heavy division. About 75% of our division deals with operational tasks, and that's custodial, paying utility bills, things that just don't necessarily have a capital element. As you can see, our historical spending levels on direct capital and facilities infrastructure, true renewal of buildings, is about $1.3 million per year. We're looking at receiving another additional $1.2 million per year this coming year in FY19. And that 100% of that money is going to go directly towards critical infrastructure projects, renewing facilities, and addressing a lot of the backlog that we have. So our buildings are some of our most varied and treasured resources. Just to give a scope and scale, we're responsible for over 200 plus facilities, which is 500,000 square feet or more. This runs across all departments: police, fire, parks and rec, public works, city hall, and library. And so we're managing all of these facilities. And as you can see in this photo, we have a pretty unique situation in Santa Barbara. Over 50% of our building stock is over 50 years old. And this is a photo of Fire Station 3, and you can see in 1940 to 2016, barring the squaring off and slightly enlarging the garage door, there's very few changes. And so we're really tasked with maintaining and adapting these facilities to a modern world and modern usage. There's very different requirements today for electrical, data, structural, code issues, all this kind of stuff that we're up against whilst keeping them housed in these same facilities that have been here for 50, 60, sometimes 80 plus years. Structural, life safety, and ADA compliance alone kind of add huge dollar amounts to any renovations we do. If we go in and do even minor renovations on these facilities, we're required to perform a lot of these code upgrades that didn't necessarily exist in the past, which create a huge financial burden for going in and maintaining buildings. What's shown here is a 5-year look ahead for rough numbers for our facilities funding. This is kind of highlighting our capital funding gap. So historically, we've been operating on a really lean budget with a pretty substantial capital funding gap, infrastructure gap. And this data comes from our work order system, our capital planning model, and the budget. So you can see historically our direct spending on capital infrastructure and building improvement has been about $1.3 million. Our capital need is about $2.7 million, and that would be to keep up with proactive maintenance for the buildings moving forward. The part in orange is the Measure C component, so you can see really how much that helps to address our buildings backlog need. So what this does is it kind of shifts our gears when what we look at with deferred maintenance is kind of pushing a building or a system or a piece of equipment, HVAC and a roof, just pushing it beyond its life. And that's kind of the situation we've been forced into. And it's a very reactive way to manage a building, and it often leads to higher costs overall. A lot of our repairs are responsive, they're emergency repairs, and we're really only handling buildings and roofs and situations that are the most critical. And so this is not necessarily an efficient way or a cost-effective way to maintain a building. Similar to streets, Measure C has kind of dynamically changed our outlook going forward. So as of now, we have a deteriorating building stock. We're kind of doing our best to use the dollars that we have to triage and address critical maintenance repairs. It is a very reactive approach, and we're having to let a lot of critical maintenance slide that we just can't get to. With additional funding, we're going to be able to move into more of a whole building approach as opposed to a system approach. So now and in the past, we'd replace a roof here, an HVAC unit here as they'd fail. But now we're going to have the opportunity to kind of holistically look at an entire building and harness economies of scale and really look to improve that building for the next 10 or 15 years going forward, instead of saying, hey, let's just get this thing through the next rainy season. So the angle is really to switch from a reactive to a proactive approach. And with that come a couple of the projects that Measure C will directly fund. These three fire stations, Fire Station 3, 4, and 5, are some of our most maintenance needed buildings. All three of these buildings have pretty critical roofing issues. Fire Station 3 is on Sola, and Fire Station 4 is up on Upper State, on Ontario, and Fire Station 5 is on Modoc, right beside the school there. And so what this will do is we're going to put about $750,000 to these three facilities, and it'll allow us to get in there and renew the facility as a whole, replace the roofs, HVAC upgrades, electrical, and get these facilities back up and running and going for 10, 15 years going forward is the aim. Fire Station 3 was built in 1929. It has significant dry rot and plumbing issues and some roofing issues, and so just anything you'd expect with a building that was built in 1929. And so as with 3 and 4 and 5, these buildings are in major need. Similar approach for the East Side Library. The East Side Library was built in 1973 and has had very little capital spending on it since its construction. It has a leaking roof. It has a pretty substantial work order history. And so this project would allow us to replace the roof, make some critical electrical upgrades, some code upgrades, plumbing, and do some interior renewal. So the building will just be revitalized. It'll look newer, it'll feel newer, and it'll perform a lot better. Los Baños swimming pool, the boiler replacement. This is kind of a perfect example of reactive maintenance. Currently, we're spending a fair amount of money on the boilers per year, about $10,000 to $15,000 in annual repairs, significant downtime, and we're kind of just riding that edge. It's a 2-boiler system, and so we're quite often down to 1 boiler. If both of those go down, then that pool will be cold and unusable, and we'll get lots of complaints. So this is a real example of proactively maintaining and replacing those boilers to a very public and well-used facility before there's an emergency repair. In addition to the Measure C projects, we're going to be doing some of our regularly funded capital projects. We put about $500,000 into capital projects out of our budget directly. So some of these projects are going to include windows and HVAC at Fire Station 6, City Hall, some interior improvements. I'm not sure if any of you have been in the lower staff area at the Central Library, but it's way beyond in need of renovation. So we're going to be working with the library on that, and I know they have funding for it, as do we. So we'll chip in on the building-related things, carpet, lighting, HVAC, and they're going to handle their operational stuff, desks, and circulation. In addition to, in addition to our kind of core capital projects, we are looking at doing some energy projects as well. So FY19 will be the first full cycle where we see some injection of energy savings funds from the utility management program. So we're looking at roughly $100,000 that was saved from utility bills, and this will be direct reinvestment into energy efficiency projects. We look at that as capital, as most of the stuff we're doing is lighting and capital-related spending for now, when it comes to energy efficiency. In addition to that $100,000 that's getting fed back into our buildings to make them more efficient, there is funding for an energy strategic plan. We're working through an RFP right now to get a consultant on to help us meet our renewable goal. What was promised to council was that by December, late of this year, we'll have a report to you from a consultant, giving us kind of a roadmap to how we can meet these renewable goals. And so that funding has been made available, and it will be managed through our division. This is just a quick snapshot of our FY19 capital projects and how the funding breaks down. And again, the idea here is just to see the scope and scale of how much the Measure C funding is going to help. It's really going to move us into a new way of doing business and just really rejuvenate our buildings and be able to tackle a lot more. Another increase is the $350,000 in ADA transition plan funding. That'll be very welcomed. As I mentioned before, the code compliance that come with building renovation is always hefty, and so that's something we're always up against. And with that, that's the overview of our FY19 facilities capital. So I'd love to answer any questions if you had any.
Thanks. Mr. Hart, go ahead and
If
start.
I'm looking at slide 29, what exactly is that again? The facilities capital funding gap. So is that things like roofs that need to be replaced that would otherwise cost more if they weren't replaced? So this is getting ahead of the maintenance curve that prevents future cost, in my understanding, that category properly?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, we're currently way behind the curve. Mm-hmm. And so what the blue dotted line is what our renewal model is. So this is if we were to replace roofs and equipment and systems on their regular intervals. Mm-hmm. So an HVAC unit may last 10 years, may last 15 years. Our capital renewal software maps that out. And so if we were to be meeting those on an annual basis, our need for capital infrastructure funding would be $2.7 million per year. That line is slightly increasing, basically due to inflation. Mm-hmm. So it just kind of gives a scale of how much we're deferring. So every year that we're not meeting that amount of maintenance means that we're pushing stuff down the road, which could eventually become an emergency repair, become more expensive in the future.
So then at the beginning of Measure C, when we're trying to figure out how to allocate this revenue, why wouldn't that orange bar match that graph, the blue bar going out in time, rather than having that add to that deficit over time? There's trade-offs. You can't do everything, but this is one of those things where a dollar spent today saves $5 in the future. And so what is being done that has the same or better rate of return that doesn't boost that Measure C funding up to match that graph?
Yeah, I'd agree that from a facilities point of view, matching our backlog completely would be the way to go. But I'm not the only one who is in this game or in this situation. Mm-hmm. So I know the exact thing applies with streets. They have deferred maintenance where expenses to replace roadways increase going into the future. Mm-hmm. So we're just not the only need. As far as priority goes, that's something that's worked out internally, and we've been working over that over the last 3 to 6 months.
Okay. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, it's a perfect Measure C conversation you'll have at Finance Committee tomorrow and in a couple of weeks. But I'll just share, if you recall, Measure C, when it was crafted, we knew it wasn't going to solve all of our infrastructure needs. We had a certain dollar amount, and Measure C was going to get us a long way there, but not all the way there. The other frustrating part we're all going to have is we want to have it all done tomorrow. And Measure C is a multi-decade program of getting at backlogs. But you've got needs in your fire station facilities. Fire Station 7 needs to be rebuilt. You've got parks and recreation facilities that have a lot of deferred maintenance and need complete overhaul. You've got the library that has a lot of capital investment that people would like to see. You have got a number of categories within the streets and roads when you talk about storm drains. We don't even have a storm drain master plan and haven't touched. The ADA, we could be putting more money into ADA. I think every category could use more money. And so we have proposed as staff our professional recommendation about how to do it. You all, as part of this process, are going to react to that. And you could say we're going to fund something more and take away from somewhere else. But it's a zero-sum game, and they're all priorities in our book. So we tried to spread it as evenly as possible.
Well, I'm just trying to understand all the pieces of this so that there is the moment when those value judgments can be made that I know the most about this and wanting to see how these pieces fit together. So this is a big critical slide that we should all remember for a future conversation, is that, you know, this was one of the things we thought we needed to really address so that we don't spend more money down the road. And then there will be things that are enhancements and additions that are nice to have, but maybe aren't as critical as this in terms of the dollars spent versus dollars saved.
And it's great. And I always want to preface, as I do with staff, it's a great conversation that we're able to have when we're talking about Measure C not being quite enough. But when you talk about complete streets, that would be then prioritizing complete streets over some other critical infrastructure needs. And so, in my mind, they're all really important. And so it's hard to pick who you want to favor and give that little extra to at the expense of something else. And you're right, you're starting now to see snippets. Tomorrow you'll see a more comprehensive approach there as well. But I'd like you to kind of keep that in mind when you see the whole picture in play, so that you know where do you need to take of to help someone else out a little bit more.
And your advice is, when will that moment be that all the pieces of the puzzle are put together?
The Measure C conversation tomorrow at Finance Committee, and then a couple weeks out with the full council as well. We didn't bring it as part of Public Works because, quite frankly, Measure C is not a Public Works program.
Right.
There are other departments that are involved and are funded through that as well. And so we're bringing it as part of the general government approach, so that you have the benefit of seeing all the priorities and needs, and then you can make those policy directions to us, and we'll respond to that and happily implement it. Because again, each and every line item on Measure C that we're proposing or funding is really needed and really critical. So you won't hear any objection to us about spending money. I just want to make sure you've got the full picture of what expense it's going to come from in other areas.
But I guess, to be really clear, tomorrow we're not going to have the result of the plans that are underway that are going to develop over the next 3 months. So we're going to have...
You're looking at FY19 Measure C program. And from our standpoint, Measure C, like I said, is a multi-decade long effort. And so, yes, we are going to be doing some planning work over the next few months and probably over the next few years about how to prioritize where the money should go strategically. We don't have all the answers. It's been 5 months since Measure C passed, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. So I understand your frustration, and you want to lock it down now and get it really dialed in. And we're saying we're working on it, but it's probably 3 to 4 months out, and we'll be better informed as part of the capital improvement project next fiscal year to kind of have that lined up. Not sure that's going to meet your desire to have all the answers and information right now to kind of lock in a multi-year program. So I think there is a little disconnect on your sense of urgency and our methodical approach of wanting to get information and facts kind of in line and make good, prudent decisions. So we'll have to find out where we can land together on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other lights. So is it water resources, drought, planning, and response?
Yes. Madam Mayor, council members, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. Here today with a little different story than we've been talking about. I was looking back somewhere maybe between 40 and 50 presentations since 2014 to the City Council and the community, updating us on where we are with this drought and dealing with some very difficult situations and just difficult decisions. And I think today we're standing in a very different place because we made some of those very difficult decisions. We've come a long ways, and I hope to kind of share with you where we are and how we're kind of headed there. So, of course, we're still in a drought. In fact, we're wrapping up the 7th year of this drought. We had on our worst case planning a 6-year drought, so we've gone beyond that. We're already planning, and you'll hear a presentation tomorrow, we're planning out 10 years. 10 years of this drought right now. That's what we're planning. You're going to see a presentation tomorrow on that. Really taking the long-term approach on this and looking ahead at the 8th year of this drought. So this is unprecedented. This is an unprecedented drought, certainly for this region of California. This drought started in 2011, but it wasn't until 2014 that we actually declared this drought emergency, as dry cycles are pretty common around here, a year or 2 or 3 years without much rainfall, but this just keeps going. Despite all we've been through, our community has really stepped up in the 30% conservation and enduring significant rate changes as a result of the increased costs for this drought. And I'm going to touch a little bit on what those were. So increased capital. Of course, the first image there is of desal, but we also had wells. We had state water purchases, purchasing water. We continue to do that. Water quality. We've been spending a lot of money on water treatment, chemicals and materials to make sure that we can treat this water to meet all of state regulatory requirements. And then, of course, we've had to implement some pretty significant projects to make sure that we can keep moving water, our state water and Kachuma water, to the South Coast. In total, this is about $90 million in capital just right here alone that we've been spending to make sure that we can ensure water for our community. To compound that, we've been challenged by our rate structure. The state kind of dictates how our rates are structured in many ways. And during normal times, we completely support that. They're structured to encourage conservation. And so to get there, the state has fixed how much we can charge as a fixed meter charge. So when we get on your bill, it says fixed meter charge. That can't exceed 30% of our revenue. So what that means is it shifts 70% of our revenue coming from this variable charge, how much water people use. So I have a little graphic in here on the next slide to show, but that is significantly compounds things. When people reduce their water usage, it's not a one-to-one for how our expenses look. 90% of our expenses are fixed, whether I deliver 100 acre feet or 10,000 acre feet. A lot of the only variable we really have on that is the chemical and electrical costs. The labor, the capital work that needs to be done to maintain our infrastructure is all there. Furthermore, the tiered rate structure, particularly you get up into, for us, we have a wide variety of our tiers. And so when you get the instability, when you get a lot of tier 3 usage changes, that has a big impact on our revenues and makes it difficult to predict revenue, which leads to that uncertainty. So just wanted to put a little graphic together to show that had our costs been completely flat, we hadn't had the $90 million in additional capital costs, just the reduction in water sales alone would have led to an 18% increase in rates, just to try and kind of frame what that looks like. So we had a few years, obviously, of multiple digit rates increases, but I'm happy to say that I think we have turned the corner and we're to a position now where our rates going forward should need very small increases and take into effect the operation of desal and ongoing drought conditions. Here's just a snapshot of how our rates stack up against our neighbors. And, you look at our, the light blue is our 4 HCF user, someone using a low water user in our community, is actually paying the least on the South Coast for water. Someone using 10 HCF, which we consider to be about an average user, is paying right in the ballpark. I think it's right in the mix with all of our neighbors. And then, of course, our high users are paying the most. But I think this speaks a lot to it. We have taken on a lot of costs, including the reactivation of our desal plant. I'm not sure why our neighbors' costs are that high, but ours include the full operation of that facility going forward. So where have we been and how far have we come? So in FY16, we were facing desal construction challenges. We had a lot of water supply uncertainty. So we were at the time asking for our community for 40% conservation because Kachuma was at 77% of capacity. We were uncertain about our water revenues because there seemed to be a lot of change, and those changes impact how much revenue is coming in. And then, of course, we were internally deferring capital projects because we wanted to make sure that we had enough to keep the lights on. Now in FY19, we have desal has been online and producing consistent water, high quality water. We have, I believe, now some supply redundancies in our system that we were running on the margins, and now we have some capacity should we lose one of our supplies. We are seeing a consistent 30% conservation from our community. The last time we were seeing that was in 1958, the current amount of water this community is using. I mean, that is spectacular, and this community has been doing it month after month. And then, of course, what I'm here to kind of share with you next is we actually have now some room in our reserves to get back to funding some of this deferred capital, which I'm pleased to discuss. So one of those items is something that we actually were working on actively in 2014 and had to put on hold, but this is an advanced metering infrastructure. We believe this is the next step for us to help in that communication with our customers about how did I use that much water? Where did it go? This is that technology that really bridges that gap for us to help our community and residents understand their water usage more, rather than that once a month snapshot that we'll be getting 6-minute increments of what kind of water usage was going on, where did that leak start, communicating when those when the leak started, and hopefully being able to stop it sooner rather than later. We're also, as part of the capital, we're looking to do what we call water quality optimization. So we have all these different sources. How can we take all those different sources and blend them so that we have a consistent, higher quality water for all of our community? Then, of course, we have impacts to the distribution system. We're looking, as we've discussed the discussions with Montecito, the conveyance pipeline. We've got some money in there to fund our portion of it, along with also doing a distribution master plan or water system master plan. To my knowledge, we've never done one. And keep in mind, the system was built basically around fire flows, built to store a lot of water. And we're now in a time where storage of water is important, but more importantly is turning that water over and ensuring the highest quality water. And so taking a look at the design of our water system and how best to optimize it as we go forward and replace pump stations and reservoirs in the future. And then, of course, our main replacement program, we're going to be coming back to you. I apologize, we tried to get to you earlier, but we're going to be coming back to you in June to give you an update on our water main program and why it's so important that we put additional funding to this effort. We did complete a study, and it shows that we really need to be basically doubling our main program to try and get ahead of a significant amount of pipe that's going to be reaching the end of its useful life soon, and actually could see our main breaks start going up even higher than they already are. So wanting to put some additional funding to that to shoot for a 2% goal on an annual basis. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
You must have given a great explanation because I don't. Oh, Mr. Friedman, go ahead.
Thanks. I had a couple questions just regarding the desal expansion or potential desal expansion. So if we were to go forward and to the next thing, how many acre feet would we expand it to? Right now we're at 3125. So what would that expand to, and what would the cost be to get there?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman. So we are not recommending expansion, at least this year, but we did take a look at those costs, and the next increment for us would be about 625 acre feet, which would put the facility at 3,750 acre feet. That expansion is roughly in the $3 to $4 million range to handle that additional water in the system to expand the treatment plant.
Okay, and then that wouldn't be able to serve basically beyond where our low-lying areas are now, correct? Because sometimes they're at full capacity, so we'd have to expand the conduit.
We have a pump station located up by the hospital that allows us to take water and move it out of the low zone, but it does have its limits. We can expand that pump station one more time, but adding that additional will basically tap out that pump station. It'll be at its maximum. Again, the challenge is really in the winter when demand is really low and we're putting all that water in, we need to get it out of the low zone. typically like this time of year when it starts to warm up, there's plenty of demand in the low zone. We really don't have the capacity limitation.
Okay, great, thanks. And then one other question for the advanced metering. What's the timeline for that to be implemented?
My goal is within the next 5 years. I think what we'd like to do is get started on a pilot and really identify what the best technology is for us, and have a few manufacturers come in and implement their equipment and see how it works. We have certainly the parks has been raising their hand and saying we'd be happy to test anything you have, and I've got some water commissioners also raising their hand saying please add me to that test group. But I think we want to kind of see what's out there. There's technology ranges pretty significantly, and but I think at the end of the day it will all be a significant improvement from where we're at right now.
Thanks. Councilmember Dominguez.
So the decision on whether to conserve more water or increase the desal capacity, what's the status of that decision?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we will be back tomorrow to talk about that as part of our water supply strategy update. And just to jump ahead, basically we're not recommending any changes to our current plan. We believe we have adequate water going out for the next 2 years.
So no increase in the desal for the next 2 years? Okay, thank you.
At least a no decision on that. We'll revisit it next spring once we see how next winter goes, because it will take some time to get that expansion in place.
We'll look forward to your report tomorrow. Okay, thank you for that.
So that was managing infrastructure and water, and kind of an overview of those three big topics. But now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the specifics on performance objectives and highlight some of our capital projects. And I'll start first in our division, transportation planning and parking, but then we're going to move to engineering and fleet after that.
Thank you.
So for a lot of the Paradise performance measures, it's really interesting. We're paralleling them with what Matt Floor is doing with the Sustainability Committee and the Sustainability Committee goals. And we're doing that specifically so that we can track those as well, and that they're actually budget activated, so that we're not having two different things. We're just having a congruent process with that. So when you see that little sustainable Santa Barbara in the corner on our Paradise performance measures, those are the ones that are also in the Sustainability Committee's goals. Safe Routes to School we've been doing that program for 5 years now, and we contract with Coast to do teaching in the schools for bicycle and pedestrian safety for the kids. And so having done it for 5 years, we're going to, in this next year, in this budget, evaluate the effectiveness of the program and see if there's anything that we can do to make it better, and see how many of our kids are responding to that, what are the outcomes of that now that we've had 5 years under our belt. One of the things that happened in 2013 is the state passed a bill called SB 743, and what that bill does is it essentially ends traffic congestion, as an environmental impact. And so we have until January 1st to comply with that, which means that we have to work with community development and come to council with a new threshold, which will no longer be traffic congestion under level of service. It'll now be called VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. It's a new way of measuring travel impacts. At the same time, we will be coming to council to add to the growth management traffic congestion policy the level of service standards that we've used to gauge development. So we're not completely losing it. It's just moving from the environmental issue to a policy issue. Vision Zero is a resolution that the council passed in 2016. And what it does is it assumes that all collisions are avoidable, and that no collision is acceptable. And so we're moving forward with a program and a plan. We'll be in the next 6 months, we'll be back at council with a Vision Zero action plan and how to implement it. But this is the coordination with engineering and police and transportation planning and public works to coordinate and be more coordinated around the severe collisions and deaths that we have. The goal the council put forward is to eliminate those by 2030. So we're going to continually monitor those every single year to see our effects and how we're being effective in reducing those collisions. One example of Vision Zero that's already taken place is we had the pedestrian death in the 400 block, the mid-block crossing of someone running that stoplight and killing a pedestrian this year. And that's the third pedestrian we've had killed. Already, PD has done spot enforcement on State Street, and engineering is working on a plan to highlight those signals and make them more visible to motorists. The bicycle master plan was approved by council in 2016, and now we're on a feverish, pretty aggressive schedule to complete phase one of the plan, which is it's a lot of money, and we've got a lot of money from the active transportation planning grant of the state of California. And last Thursday, the California Transportation Commission approved a $15 million grant for the project that's on the screen, which is not the roundabout, but it's the pathway to the roundabout. This is an off-street path that goes all the way up from this roundabout to Modoc, all the way up Las Positas, and then from Las Positas out Modoc to the county line. So this is a huge win for the city and a milestone project that has been on the books since 1974. And so this is our something we're going to be watching. It's also on our sustainable Santa Barbara goals, is to implement phase one by 2020. One of the things that we've fine-tuned in coordination with community development is to make sure that when you see their performance objectives and then Public Works' performance objectives with land development, related to land development, in the past, they've been somewhat different because they measure different metrics. We've coordinated with them to get 3 metrics that are the same. So one thing you'll notice in the budget is that when you see that performance measure, it occurs consistently across the board through all divisions and departments. The train is working and it's happening. We have 25 employees of the city of Santa Barbara who are taking the train. That number is increasing weekly. And with it, we are proposing in this budget with this preparedness performance measure to reassess the work trip program. This is the program that subsidizes employees for travel. So we have them in transit, we have them in local MTD buses, riding on bikes, and in carpools. And one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about is the equity of how we do this program. For instance, if you're in a carpool, you get a much greater subsidy than if you're walking, which you get no subsidy, and if you're a cyclist, you get a tune-up every year. So we're going to take a stab at looking at the equitable share of this program this year. There are many permits that are given to residents. Actually, over 3,000 residential parking permits every single year are given out. In addition to all sorts of other permits, we now have the new oversized vehicle permits. None of these permits at this time can be online, and so we want to bring this process up to an online capacity so that people don't have to physically come into the office. And so this year we're hoping to implement that process online. The ambassadors are doing great from all counts. We're getting a lot of great receptivity from business owners and other community members. But we really want to establish a system, a metric that shows if we're really making a difference. The goal of the ambassador program is to enhance the experience on State Street. So with this budget, we're proposing to come up with some sort of metric system that helps us determine how effective of a job the ambassadors are doing. The REA building down at the depot, the railroad depot, half of it is leased by Greyhound. They're in their 4th year. And we're leasing the other half, or proposing to lease the other half of the building. We feel like the Funk Zone some kind of funk zone related use or railroad related use, something like that will be perfect for the area. And since the funk zone is so popular and this parking lot is now fully used at capacity on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays because of funk zone activities, we really feel like we can get a good use at the highest rent. We recently did an evaluation of all the parking facilities, specifically the structures, and the one recommendation that we were given that we're proposing to implement in this budget is to redo the railings in Ortega and Canna Perdido garages. The consultant found that these railings were not sufficient if someone were to mistakenly forward their vehicle versus backing, so we have a capital project plan for that. And then downtown parking requires about $400,000 to $600,000 a year in its budget to throw off from revenues. It requires that amount to be sustainable for maintaining the whole system over time. And so we've been able to do that pretty successfully over time, throwing off that cash into the reserves to pull into capital projects and maintenance projects to sustain the system. Well, as you look at the chart, in recent times in this fiscal year, we actually came very close, and a lot of that was due to the fire in December and some loss of some revenues, but we have projected into the future that these lines are going to be close, or actually our expenses are going to exceed revenues. Part of that issue is the minimum wage that is rising. So we're proposing to work with the Downtown Parking Committee on a 5-year financial strategic plan to make adjustments to the program to get ahead of this curve and get us back on track to throwing off the right amount of money to maintain the system. And then finally, one of our project highlights, which we're excited about, in working with the library and facilities, is we're looking at we're releasing a request for a proposal to put solar on top of the library garage. And because the properties are located next to each other, the goal will be to do a zero out the electricity bill of the library. So it just so happens we've had these two assets together and the availability on the roof to do the solar to make that happen. And with that, we'll answer any questions.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Dayton, you talked about trying to have some measurables for the ambassadors, but their main function is to create an experience, which is be anecdotal. So what kind of things could you try to quantify? I'm kind of having a hard time following that one.
That's a good question, Councilmember Rouse. We have to look at exactly how we do that. I think it will be difficult, but we don't want to avoid it just because it's difficult. And that could be something as simple as intercept surveys from year to year to gauge the public's experience on the street and business owners' experience, surveys for the business owners.
And then when you mentioned your capital needs, your annual capital needs, but how the lines are being crossed through the revenues, but you also have some extraordinary expenditures now. I mean, with the MTD, wasn't it within this last year that doubled the MTD contribution? So what's the outlook for that, and how do we possibly keep up with that?
That's correct. We did add the shuttles to the contract, and that added about $450,000 specifically to this budget, and that is part of what you're seeing the lines come together. And we're working with MTD on their yearly upgrade. But one of the things that we'll have to look at is how do we keep the service that we have on the street from year to year and see the dollar amount go up, or do we make small adjustments to keep it flat? For instance, last year we removed 1 hour from the service to keep the expense flat. But that is exactly why we need to do the 5-year strategic plan, to look at all the pieces and what are the things that need to be dialed differently to make sure that we're throwing off the amount of money into the capital reserves to maintain the facility.
Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez.
I'm glad to see you're doing these performance evals of both the safe routes to schools and the ambassadors program. I think it's important that we continually measure the effectiveness and increase resources if it's serving the city, and then diminish them if it's not, or tweak it. You mentioned, I think, solar, and I know we've changed some of the lighting in the parking garages. Have we looked at more aggressive solar in the past and had a reason not to, or is that just something we haven't looked at?
Councilmember Dominguez, well, downtown parking in particular has not looked specifically at solar. I know facilities maybe have something else to offer on that. They're looking at a lot of different options, and they specifically address us with this idea, and we just think it's really good. There may be other opportunities as Edison changes the rules on proximity and do aggregation, where we can meet the city's goal of getting to zero and be sustainable for all our resources. And our garages are probably going to be good targets for those arrays.
How much electricity are they using? What's our biggest user? Which one of the garages?
Well, right now, as you mentioned, we are in the process of changing everything out to LED, and they're making dramatic changes to our electricity. For instance, we're saving $60,000 in next year's budget because of the electricity drop. So the garages that have yet to have the lights replaced are the ones that are the big eaters, but they will be replaced within the next 2 years.
Does it pencil out still to put in solar for the LED powered garages?
It does, as long as the equipment that we're putting in sustains, as long as it's warranty that the manufacturer's saying it will live for. And I think this is kind of the challenge even for homeowners that change out LEDs to see the electronics is a little bit more complicated. It's not just the LED diode; it's also the electronics behind it. And sometimes that can fail. If those start failing, then it wouldn't pencil out.
And you're saying they might fail because of the solar power?
Oh, no.
Or of their own accord?
Just on their own accord, the equipment that we're putting in.
Okay. So would you consider putting in solar at some of the parking lots in the next year? Do you need to wait for a master plan to do that?
We're very open to it, and I know we're working with facility. Do you want to answer some of that? Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez. The big issue with solar is matching our load to where we can physically install it. So parking garages are nice. They've got the space, but they don't have the load. So until we can work something out with Edison to where we can wheel power, it's really not economic. There is tariffs out there that allow you to wheel power in a way, but the idea that you're selling power back to Edison at a much lower rate than you're generating it at really hurts the economics. So until there's some fundamental shift there, we will have trouble matching where our loads are, places like El Estero, places like the airport, places that are really, really intensive users with geographically spacious locations.
And Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, and please help me out if I'm getting this right or wrong. We're also proposing in the budget an energy master plan of sorts that's kind of looking at all of our facilities and opportunities for increasing renewable energy, especially solar. And then CCE dials into that question as well, which gets to that question about, do you have to generate the power on site to offset the load there, or can be a more campus-wide approach, which would make it much more advantageous then to pursue some of those projects where the load might not be exactly on site.
Yeah, exactly. This will be a perfect output of the strategic energy plan. So this $200,000 that was set aside, and we're in an RFP process right now, so we're selecting a consultant to do exactly this. Kind of some out-of-the-box thinking and find us some locations that would make sense, or if they have some know-how from other areas where we can do things in a more inventive manner. So within the next 6 months, we're going to have a pretty nice roadmap that'll answer a lot of these questions.
That's great, and I really support the strategic plan. I was just thinking that the LED light replacements and solar are things that everyone everywhere are doing because they've proven to be money savers in the long run. And when you showed the curve with the parking lots where we have money in the system now, but we won't in the future, that seems to me the best picture for doing something like solar where we actually have the capital to expend. And in terms of the size, you're absolutely right. We're getting paid, 3 cents per kilowatt from Edison, and they're charging, 13, 18 cents. So it doesn't make sense to put in a big solar panel if we're not going to use a lot of that electricity. But maybe at the parking lots, we can put in panels that match the size of the electricity being used, because that would be a cheaper capital investment and less work and less, I think, work at the committees and boards getting it through. So
there's some economies of scale there. The library parking lot is so perfect because it has such a big user right beside it. When you start building carports to host solar, it gets expensive pretty quickly. So if you're doing that on a really small scale, there's still a lot of the fixed cost there to put up a carport, and then you may only have 8 or 10 spaces to serve the load of lights in the parking garage.
Okay, well, that would be my 2 cents, is to more aggressively do that while we still have the capital.
Okay. Mr. Hart.
Yeah, following up on that, Mike, I guess this is still for you. I'm sorry. How are you working around that issue of the single meter with the library and the parking structure?
So that's interesting. It's because they share that space. And so Edison is a little bit flexible with a parcel or places that are not across a physical, a public right-of-way roadway. And so the only thing that divides them is that library avenue. And so they've been amenable to consolidating those meters into one bill. Okay. And it's not even a physical install, it's just an on-paper consolidation of those meters so that solar from the parking lot can then be credited to the library meter.
Well, that's great news. That's a big, solid success. Thank you. Getting back to Mr. Dayton, your presentation about evaluating the effectiveness of the Safe Routes to School program. So is that a placeholder for evaluating effectiveness of other things kind of in that same space, like, for example, zip cars or the bike station efforts, or is that just a standalone for evaluating the effectiveness of the coast effort?
That's a good question, Mr. Hart. Yes, the Safe Routes to School Paradise Performance Measure is specifically just that. But we are indeed evaluating zip car as well.
When would that be coming back to council, the zip car evaluation?
Well, right now with Zipcar, the biggest challenge has been their lack of marketing. And so we're seeing first if we can get them on target with marketing. In the agreement that we have with the city, they proposed a certain marketing campaign that has not yet been done. And so while we see great usage on 2 cars, the other cars are not so hot. And we'd like to see that marketing program done to get a fair evaluation of the program, because if people aren't aware that those cars are there, we're not sure that they're effective.
Something I have learned recently about that is that if you do a Yelp search on zip cars or a Google search, there's a lot of bad information about the operation of that company. And I get that maybe it's marketing. It also could be the product and people doing research. And so I think that needs a lot of looking into, because it was shocking to me to read about the Better Business Bureau actions, the Attorney General of the state of New York, lots of bad customer interactions from that company. And I'm concerned that the city in a way is representing that this is something that's been vetted, and I don't know that it has. So I think we should do that evaluation sooner rather than later. And then who is our contractor for Bike Station now? Is it the Bicycle Coalition?
Actually, the downtown parking has taken over that service. So rather than paying someone else $25,000 to do it and then the revenue, we've just folded that in with our internal staff. And then we're taking the revenue from the bike station into the budget, which has helped.
Well, I think it'd be good to have an evaluation of all these things, at the same time. So I'd urge you to hurry up and do that and add that to that list. And then the staff effort involved in reassessing the work trip subsidies. How big a work project is that?
I don't think it's a super significant work product. It's probably going to take the new mobility coordinator, once they're up to speed, probably something like a month and a half to do.
Good. And then the REI building tenant, how long has that building been vacant?
I think it's been vacant for about 3 years.
Okay. And so the waiting on getting a tenant was to explain why there hasn't been an effort to lease that.
So
prior to this.
when we were doing it, it's when the funk zone was just starting to get up to speed, and the thought was to hold it so that when the funk zone did get up to speed, now it's like thriving. Our parking lot's full. Before the depot was more of a sleepy place in terms of the volumes. Now we see lots of activity in there, and so there's the opportunity to get not just something like a Greyhound, but something maybe that more serves the vibe and what's going on in the lot.
Okay, and then how do you balance the parking demand for that in that space? You know,
Well,
something more successful has its own parking demand. That lot's already full.
It probably wouldn't be as much of a destination as something that's served by people who are in the area already looking to, do a secondary trip. Could be something like a coffee shop. We've talked to some brokers. We have a broker that's coming on board that suggested some ideas for us. We also have Avis, who's approached us, who wants to be in the lot. We're a little concerned about that because of the amount of cars that they would bring and how that would take up spaces. But we do feel like we can get rents now that are more like the Greyhound rent that we're getting, which is $4,250 a month, which is pretty high for the amount of space that we have. And that's what we'd like to. When we look at a long-term lease, we'd want to look at a higher rent.
Yeah, that's a tricky situation, and I'd like to hear more about that in the future. But I don't know that I noticed it in the past that it was empty. But that lost rent in that time is not, you don't get that back. It's kind of like the whole philosophy of what we're looking at State Street. We're in a situation where I don't know that we're going to get a long-term tenant, and if we are, should we have just had a short-term tenant for the past 2 years? So something to think about in the future is vacant spaces that are revenue generating. It's a good idea to have a tenant and have income during those things. So if that's something like this, if there's anything else like this that exists, it's probably a good idea to look at it.
Good. Okay, just real quick, because I know we're up to 5:30, but the Las Positas bike facility, so that's going to be for recreation, obviously, right, because it goes to the beach, but there's some commuting opportunities there too. But people who live on the Mesa would use that to bike to the commercial areas. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, Madam Mayor. When we did the ATP grant for this project, we made the argument that it would be a strong commuter route, particularly on the MODOC side that's coming from the UCSB trail, the Auburn Trail.
Okay. That's it for this section. And what's next, Mr. Dayton? Engineering?
So, thank you, Mr. Dayton. For engineering, I will highlight just a few items from the annual performance plan for both engineering services and land development engineering. In engineering services, so I'm sticking with this 3E theme of efficiency, effectiveness, and execution. So just one item under each of those. Under efficiency, we continue to track our soft costs on all capital projects. Soft costs are basically everything other than the construction contract. And we have two different measures. One is for large projects, one is for small. A large project we've defined as anything over $400,000, and the measure that we have is 20% or less of soft costs on those larger projects. And on the smaller projects, on the less than $400,000 projects, our aim is to keep the soft cost below 35% of the total project cost. We've been tracking that. We have quite a few years of records tracking that. And under effectiveness, we added a measure for this year to develop a CAD training program. We have need for staff who are trained in AutoCAD, and a lot of the training has been on-the-job training, and we think that they can be a lot more effective if we develop this training program that would be specific to the things that we do in engineering for our public works projects. And under execution, we have added in the P3s coordination meetings with our clients, so that would be Mr. Dayton, Mr. Hagmark, and Mr. Dewey, just regular coordination meetings with them to talk about the projects, the priorities, and assignment of work, those types of things. We feel like having that in there will require us to do that meeting. We have plenty of meetings, but it seems like that with the specific focus of execution will be something that will help us to move our projects forward. So that's it for engineering services, and the next slide is land development engineering. One of the things on efficiency, we talked about this earlier, is the Acela program, which is what will host the permitting information as we transition over from Tidemark. So that's in the P3, and the transition should be fully implemented in the upcoming fiscal year. Under effectiveness, we have 4 different measures that all have a 90% on-time response rate. That includes building permits, DART comments, PRT comments, and public improvement plans. And under execution, again, kind of like with the engineering services, it's this coordination with the stakeholders, and on the land development side, it's the overall LDT, and we've aligned a lot of the measures with the LDT, as Mr. Dayton mentioned earlier.
Very good. Mr. Dominguez has a question.
The transition to Acela, and you said sometime in the upcoming fiscal year. Could you narrow it down a little more? Is there a quarter you expect this to land in?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, I do not have the specifics on that. I'm kind of remembering hearing fall from my staff, but I can get back to you with more specifics if you would like that.
Who's in charge of that transition?
Danny Cato.
And so he's running it for both you and
Community Development.
And you guys started the same time that his department started?
It's been a coordinated effort. We're all kind of moving together, which is partly probably why it's been taking a while, is you can only move as fast as, I don't want to say the slowest, but when there's many moving parts, that's kind of the reality of a big thing like this.
So who on your staff is the accountable person?
That would be Adam Hendel,
Okay.
principal engineer.
And is he meeting on a regular basis with Danny?
Yes.
Okay. And when did you start this path to Acela? Was it the same time as they did?
Yeah, pretty much. I think it was right in the beginning. They were all in it together.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Carry on. Thanks.
That's the end. Oh, I think I blew right past this part, but this slide just kind of illustrates the activity that we've been seeing on the LDT with engineering anyway. The count on the left is basically all activity aggregated, so some of them are simple public works permits. There's other bigger things in here, but aggregated, it gives an idea of what that activity has been over the years, and it has certainly been going up, and we anticipate it will continue to do so, which is actually a good thing. It's just, trying to not only work harder, but importantly to work smarter, and that's kind of where that execution piece is.
Okay. Any other questions? We look good. So what's next? Fleet? And only his daughter's wedding would take Mr. Horvath away, right?
That's right.
That's when we get to see him. Once a year he comes and but happy to have you. What's your name again?
Thank you. Madam Mayor, members of council, my name is Sam Harmon. I'm the Fleet Supervisor for Fleet Management Division of Public Works. It's an honor to be here to speak to you today, and just want to say we have a team of 14, and it's probably the best team that we've had since, in my short career with them. But they're awesome men and women, and they're responsible for maintaining and managing 479 vehicles in the city's fleet. So in terms of our Paradise Performance Program, or our P3s, we have a lot of measurements, and they all surround 2 main objectives, and that is decreasing downtime and maintenance costs. With downtime, it's all about how well we keep vehicles in service for, departments like the fire department and police department. And it's how well we're able to provide safe and reliable transportation to meet their needs. With maintenance costs, our main targets are efficiency. We're analyzing data constantly to see what's working and what's not, and we're trying to drive down our costs. One example of a measure that we acted on recently was we made a switch to re-refined synthetic oil. And that simple change, what that did for us is allowed us to extend our service intervals by up to 5,000 miles per car. And by doing that, we reduced three main things: downtime, labor, and material costs. With alternative fuel vehicles, we've recently had a big jump with the integration of renewable diesel over the last year. So currently, out of 479 vehicles, 458 of them are powered vehicles. So out of those powered vehicles, 187 use some form of alternative fuel. And again, renewable diesel is leading the way with 114. Electric vehicles. This is a very exciting time in the automotive industry with the upcoming autonomous vehicles and also with the technological and battery changes that we're seeing in the electric vehicles. So currently we just added 4 all-electric, zero-emission electric vehicles to our fleet. These vehicles each have a range of 238 miles per charge, and we were able to take advantage of federal and state incentives, which drove down the upfront costs associated with purchasing new electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are also really good because the services that they require, as well as the maintenance that they require, is much less compared to conventional cars. So we're able to really save on downtime, labor, and material costs. Renewable diesel, as I mentioned before, we have 114 vehicles using renewable diesel. And the great thing about it is we were able to add recently 18 vehicles to the alternative fuel list that were recently unable to use the previous fuel that we were using, which was biodiesel. They couldn't use this fuel because biodiesel wasn't as stable as conventional diesel or this renewable diesel that we're now using. So low utilized vehicles or generators, for instance, emergency generators, we couldn't use it. So just by making this switch, we were able to greatly improve the number of vehicles that are able to use alternative fuel. For fleet replacement in FY19, we're targeting 42 vehicles at an estimated cost of just north of $2.5 million. 23 of those vehicles are slotted for the general fund, 16 enterprise, and 3 are for fire, one of which is a fire apparatus. That's why the figure is so high on fire. And lastly, before we get to answering any and all of your questions, I just want to take the time to invite all of you to come down and visit Fleet. Again, we have a great team, and we'd love to open our doors to you and let you come take a tour.
Any questions? I have one. Mr. Harmon, on the renewable diesel versus, I noticed that it looks like the diminishing number of compressed natural gas in the fleet that it was, say, 10 years ago or so. Are there sacrifices for the target of renewability that we're putting forth in terms of our ability to have the larger, more powerful vehicles that we need? Are they able to run as efficiently and as well on the renewable diesel as some of the CNG conversions we've made in the past?
That's a great question. Well, first let me address the compressed natural gas. So with compressed natural gas, one of the problems that we were running into is when we buy the vehicle, say we bought a vehicle from Ford, we ordered it with the CNG conversion. The vehicle is sent from Ford to a contracted upfitter. That upfitter then does the work of transferring everything over from gasoline to natural gas, and then it comes to us, the user. However, what we were running into a problem with, when we take the vehicle, the Ford vehicle, we take it to the Ford dealership doesn't honor it. And that's what we were running a big problem with. They said, well, yes, you bought it through Ford and it's a Ford authorized upfitting. However, if the dealership doesn't have enough of a compressed natural gas footprint, they're not going to invest in the software, the tools needed to maintain those vehicles. So that's why we've kind of got away from that. Now, in terms of renewable diesel, what we do is, well, first, before we don't just, take the old diesel fuel out and put the new diesel fuel in. We do a test bed, and all our tests showed there were no complaints. The users saw nothing. We talked to multiple municipalities. Nobody had any problems over several years. So we've integrated this very slowly, and we're constantly checking. Thus far, we haven't had any problems with power or sustainability. And
well,
it's
I asked
100
that because I know down in the LA Harbor they had a problem when they converted some of their larger fleet to other types of either diesel or natural gas away from the traditional diesel. Those are big machines, obviously, but I know that we have some rather large, like the vacuum reader trucks and whatnot, that probably need more power. So I was kind of wondering if we were having those problems, but I think you've answered that question. So.
Yes, sir. We are not having any problems with the renewable diesel.
Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez.
So does this fleet, these statistics include enterprise fund vehicles?
Yes, sir. Yes. You're talking about the total number of vehicles used? Yes, that is the entire fleet.
And I noticed in the budget, it looked like we're adjusting both the enterprise fund vehicle replacement program down by $227,000, and then the general fund down by $278,000.
Yes, sir. So what we do is we always have a set number of vehicles that we're replacing in a given year. However, if we identify a vehicle as being in really good condition, low miles, we're going to stretch that out as a way to recoup some of that money.
Well, I want to say I appreciate the fact, because that seems like a big chunk of money. It's about $500,000 when you add it up. And I appreciate the concreteness of your report and your invitation for us to come down and see what's going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, good job. Thank you. And that concludes that section.
Madam Mayor, members of council. So with that, I'm excited to talk to you today about our proposed changes to the two-year financial plan.
Okay.
I'm Michael Pease, Public Works Business Manager. I will be talking with you today about expenditure changes, revenue changes, changes in positions. As Ms. Bjork mentioned earlier, we don't have any changes in FTEs, but we do have some other changes I'll mention. And then our fee changes. Looking at expenditures, on this chart, you'll see going across the top, we have our current year projection, the original two-year financial plan, the second year of that plan, the recommended changes to the plan, and then across on the right, the recommended mid-cycle budget. So I'm going to go through some of the major changes you'll notice on this table. The streets funds changed pretty significantly. As you recall, Measure C was adopted, and so obviously that funding source is now being reflected in the budget, which wasn't in the original plan. The water fund, also as Mr. Hagmark was mentioning, is increasing their capital program for next year to the tune of $6 million. That's $4 million for the water main program, the additional 1%, and then additional $2 million for the other projects he was talking about, the advanced metering, et cetera. The wastewater fund is also showing a significant change. The debt service in the wastewater fund is actually going down. As you are well aware, we have some construction going on down at the El Estero wastewater plant, and with some of the changes that have been happening with that project, with those projects down there, we have seen some savings in debt service payments. We won't be making one of the payments next year because the construction isn't yet complete. So we're reflecting that in the budget. In facilities is another recipient of Measure C funds. So you'll see an increase of almost $1.2 million there. In fleet management, as Mr. Harmon was mentioning, year after year, we adjust how many vehicles are being replaced. And so next year, the funding for the replacement program is actually a little bit lower than it was in the two-year plan. So you see that. In engineering, As you recall, in February, the council added 2 additional positions for the police building project, and so those positions are being added to the budget, increase of about $400,000. Then looking at expenditures by category, so just looking at the same numbers in total, just by expenditure category rather than by fund. You'll see again Measure C being one of the largest changes, and the change in the water infrastructure projects. Again, $6 million and then $18.5 million for Measure C. For the debt service, I mentioned the wastewater reduction. There's also a reduction in the desalination debt service payments. Again, that construction has been ongoing, and as a result, we won't be making one principal payment for next year. So making that change in the budget. In our special projects category, we have some increased costs related to the city's participation in the Kachuma Operation and Maintenance Board, an additional $450,000 next year. And then also there's a water quality study that the city undertakes periodically, and I believe it's around every 10 years or so, and to look at the water distribution system. And so that's $125,000 for next year. In our supplies and services category, we have sewer tap costs going up by about $200,000 next year. That's been an area that we've seen increased volume, and they're projecting increased volume next year as well. And there are also some increases in facilities maintenance, which makes up the difference. And again, in salary and benefits, as with every budget, every annual budget, there are changes in salary and benefits as we update the payroll forecast. But this again is related primarily to the addition of 2 positions related to the police building project. Moving along to revenue changes. Again, the streets fund being a recipient of Measure C funds, you see that being added to the budget, $17.3 million. And then we've also had some increases in utility users tax and gas tax, which make up the difference. In the water fund, we're seeing an increase in water metered sales that we're projecting for next year. And then also some interest income, additional interest income, given the higher interest rates. In facilities, again, the Measure C funding, $1.2 million being added. In engineering, it's a little bit of again, related to the police building positions. Additional $400,000 in work order revenue being added to the budget. By adding those positions, they're going to be charging their time against the police building project, which then equates to approximately a $400,000 increase on the revenue side. For wastewater, again, the sewer taps that we're adding on the expenditure side have a corresponding revenue that we're adding, and then also interest income makes up an additional $200,000 being added to the wastewater fund. In fleet management, we increase from year to year, every year we adopt the budget, we increase the vehicle replacement rates to collect appropriate funds from all the city departments to be able to replace their fleet vehicles. So next year we're increasing those rates citywide by additional $150,000, and also increasing interest income in that fund given higher interest rates by another $130,000. Again, looking at the same numbers by category, we have again Measure C being added, $18.5 million in the taxes and fees and fines category. service charges being increased by the water charges for services. Water service charges to customers, and then also the sewer tap revenue in the wastewater fund I just mentioned. Overall, there's an additional $1 million in interest income expected next year, and the additional engineering work order revenue showing as internal charges, since they charge their time to capital projects. Moving along to position changes. There are no changes in the total position count in the Public Works Department, still approximately 300 employees. And as I mentioned, 2 additional police positions added mid-year. We also have some changes in position classifications. In the Facilities Division, we have a change of an Energy Analyst 2 to an Energy Analyst 3, given additional needs in that division. We also are changing a Facilities Maintenance Superintendent to an Electronics Communications Supervisor. In downtown parking, the Parking Transportation Management Program Superintendent is being changed to a Downtown Infrastructure Parking Manager, given some of the new responsibilities in that area of the city. And we also shifted a quarter of an FTE of an Administrative Specialist to the Streets Fund to reflect their change in responsibilities as it relates to the Streets Fund. And then we're also proposing to extend the 3.5 FTE drought positions that have been included in the current year budget. This includes 3 limited-term water resources specialists and 2 part-time, half-time FTE positions that are being temporarily increased to 3/4 time. Moving along to fee changes, and these are also being presented to the Finance Committee. They were presented on May 8th and May 15th, respectively, and then the wastewater fees were presented on March 20th to the Finance Committee. And I'll also note that I won't be getting into them, but the water rates were adopted last year in August. So those rates are proposed to take effect July 1st, but they are not being proposed as a change as part of this budget process. So land development, which includes engineering and transportation planning, there's a 3% across the board increase to cover expenditure increases, and this is in coordination with community development. Those fees are nearing full cost recovery, and they plan to do a fee study next year, which may propose higher increases beginning in fiscal year 20. In downtown parking, they have some language cleanup and then some updates as it relates to the oversized vehicle ordinance that was recently adopted. And they're also proposing a $100 a day facility use fee as it relates to parts of the parking garages which don't directly relate to parking spaces. Right now, they do charge for the contractors that are using the parking garages to use parking spaces, but in the paseos and other areas where there isn't a fee, they propose a $100 a day fee to use those areas. Looking at water fees, they're proposing a 3% increase for most fees to maintain full cost recovery. 2 new service fees for existing services for data logging and turning on services after hours. And then some of the adjustments that are outside of that general 3% increase include hydrant flow tests and upgrades and service taps. And they're just updating some language as it relates to estimating water consumption. Looking at wastewater rates and fees, they're proposing a 6% increase to monthly charges and unit rates, again, being consistent with their long-range financial plan to provide for CIP funding and to maintain their reserves, and they plan to do a rate study in fiscal year 19. They're also proposing a 3% across-the-board increase to wastewater fees. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions from the council? Mr. Dominguez?
So regarding the police station and the engineering salaries, so is that a complete pass-through, or what's the process there?
So what they're doing is they're charging their time to the police building project, and then that's coming into the general fund as engineering work order revenue.
And so does the money come from the police budget?
No, it comes from the capital. It comes from the capital project, the police building capital project.
And it seems like it didn't match up. I'm trying to find the numbers, but there was a 300,000 figure and a 400,000 figure, 347, 761 in adjustments. On slide 30, can't really read the number. The proposed changes to original plan revenues by fund.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the numbers aren't going to match exactly. There are a number of, any given year when we put the budget together, any number of various minor increases and decreases. We try to propose a status quo budget on a mid-cycle, which we did this year. But there are various changes in salary and benefits and other categories, just moving money around to better reflect where needs are. So it won't match exactly, but it is primarily due to the change in the police building positions.
Okay. And as much as possible, I like to watch where the money's moving. That's the reason I'm curious. And does the police department pay, or do we track with an accounting measure how much their department is spending towards buildings or facilities or other departments? Like, where will that number ultimately show up down the line if we say, how much is this department spending on facilities? Is it captured?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but let's let Mike jump in.
If it's a general fund building, we ultimately receive allocated costs because we're an internal service fund. So we receive money from the police department to maintain their facility going forward. Is that?
So and that's the maintenance component. What about the capital component? And what I'm trying to get to, let me start with that. Maybe that'll help you. If we wanted to compare one building in a department to another building in the same department, or two buildings in two different departments in terms of what it's costing the city, and I guess in some types of businesses, you would ask the controller or the accountant, what are our most expensive facilities? And they can give you a number. So with numbers like these engineering salaries, how would we capture that down the line when we wanted to see, is this an expensive building or a cheap building or something in the middle?
Councilmember Dominguez, I think I'm grasping what you're saying. You want to roll this large capital project into a long-term cost analysis of the building. As facilities, our allocations are only based on maintenance and smaller capital projects. So something of the scale of the police department, this sort of $50, $60, $80 million renewal, there's no specific budget or funding for that. It comes in the means of a large Measure C project, or maybe historically RDA funding. But we don't currently roll that into our model moving forward.
Maybe it's a question for the finance director.
Councilmember Dominguez, let me take a stab at this. Basically, the capital project, the police building project in the Measure C fund, would be the place to look for all of these costs. From the engineering time to all of the construction costs, the design costs, all of that would be captured within the capital project itself.
So it'll be a line item for a police station.
It would be one project, but there would be a number of different accounts to account for the various aspects of the project. There would be engineering services, there would be construction costs, there would be a variety of things captured within that one project. And that's actually something you could see on the city's OpenGov site. As those costs and transactions hit the project, you can see that on the OpenGov site.
Mr. Casey, Councilmember Dominguez, are you asking about a $80 million police station building, how we're tracking all those costs, or are you trying to know if we're comparing how much it is to maintain the Mackenzie Park building versus the Ortega Park building on kind of
both? I know it's being tracked, but I'm just wondering how someone could figure that out and make it a meaningful data point. Because in and of itself, a $400,000 expenditure on salaries for engineering, doesn't ring any bells or raise any red flags. But I'm just curious, when we look at the whole thing when it's done, how we know whether we did a good job or not in terms of the cost. And I know there's several things you want to look at besides cost, but I just want to kind of break it down, and at least here today when we're talking about the budget, how down the line we're going to track that.
Councilmember Dominguez, Rebecca Bjork, Public Works Director. I think that looking at a new new building project versus the maintaining existing projects are sort of looking at apples and oranges. I know certainly from the work order information that Mr. Wiltshire collects on his building maintenance, we have an actual cost of operating for our buildings, so we can sort of tell you which are more expensive buildings, and he alluded to that in his presentation for fire stations 3, 4, and 5 being high need buildings that we're doing a lot of work on, and also looking at the boilers. So we are looking at places where the ongoing maintenance cost is higher than we would like it to be, and where a capital project can help to bring that ongoing maintenance cost down. So that is a part of the metrics that we can generate from work histories on our buildings. And I also know Mr. Wiltshire is in the process of doing an asset evaluation to rebuild his predictive modeling for his different buildings so that he can start to have a better cost forecast for the different buildings throughout the city.
So for your department, for example, where would be the number of how much you spend on your buildings or your facilities?
We have an allocated cost that goes from each of our facilities to the facilities management division, and it's in each of our line items. And we actually have two. We have planned maintenance, and then we have like an operational budget for custodial and that kind of thing. So those two line items in each of our line item budgets would allocate those, and it's generally done currently on a square footage basis.
So what are those numbers for your department?
I couldn't tell you. I'd have to look at them. They're on the line items, and I don't think, do we have the allocated cost overall for facilities? Yeah, it's.
So, because that's essentially your rent, right? What you're paying for rent for your facilities, particularly if, as you said, you're breaking it down on a square footage basis.
Rent, and to some extent, some operational maintenance, the custodial, the electrical, in some cases, and it depends. So, enterprises fund those pay as you pay go. They don't have the allocated cost. General fund, it's built into our allocated cost.
And they wouldn't include the property acquisition cost because I'm assuming there's not a mortgage in most cases. Do you own?
That's correct.
Does the department own the buildings outright? And I'm talking about public works.
Yeah, and actually we just finished paying off a bond that was actually a certificate of participation that was used to build the community development side, and we paid back over a period of 20 years. So in some cases that is also built into our annual costs, but that's the only one I'm aware of that was funded like that.
Yeah, just to clarify on that, I mean, the city owns most of the land that our buildings are on. I can't think of any exception now at this point. And except for rent for city attorney's office. We got to bring you into the fold, Ariel. You're right. So I think we were aware that that's a lease. But most of the buildings that, you consider that we own, it is city land, and so it's ownership. And we have very little debt on our buildings. In some ways, we're unique compared to other governmental organizations, having just paid off this certificate of participation for Garden Street. We're very fortunate to have a pretty clean balance sheet. And I just wanted to mention on the police station, we will be tracking all those costs. We'll be tracking the staff cost, the architecture and engineering costs, the environmental review, and rolling that all up. I want to caution us now that we don't know how much that building's going to cost. We don't have a site chosen for it yet. We don't have a design. I gotta say, I'm concerned that it's going to be expensive. It'll probably be the most expensive building we ever build because of the seismic requirements for an essential facility like a police station. Just forces it to be over-engineered compared to anything else you build. So I don't have a number to give you today to track us on how well we're doing against that. That comes up in the early part of this stage now that we have an architect firm coming on board and we do go through site selection.
And I was really just using the PD building as an example. I don't have any particular concerns other than generally trying to keep our costs constrained. What is our most expensive building to maintain and operate at this point?
Councilmember Dominguez, the larger buildings, obviously the central library, but if you want to look at it on a square footage basis, some of these outbuildings are more expensive because they're so small and so old. And so you look at buildings like up at Mackenzie Park, we just did a large renovation there to kind of bring it back to life. And those buildings often get ignored, where some of the money tends to go to library, the more central buildings, City Hall. So if you're looking on a building over all dollar amount. Central Library, Police Department, City Hall, those are our largest dollar amount to maintain, but on a square footage basis, it's a lot of these out satellite buildings that.
Right. And I realize there's lots of factors, including how many users or how much revenue we're generating as well. But when we saw the curve and we were asking the question, how do we close the gap from the 2.7 million, there's, I guess, $200,000 gap there, and that's like a 7.5% gap. And I'm wondering what line of thinking or what policy you have in terms of how you prioritize. And I'm guessing you do prioritize things like roofs, where if you don't fix it right away, but is that going to be half of that $2.7 million? Is some of the least prioritized spending not really time sensitive and things that are really going to get to, 20 years from now? Like, how critical is that bottom $200,000 layer of spending?
Councilmember Dominguez, as Ms. Bjork alluded to, we are just in the process of doing a citywide condition assessment of all of our buildings. Hasn't been done in recent past, and it's a really good time with what we're getting into now. So within 3 to 6 months, I'll have all of that data at our fingertips, and it'll allow us to accurately prioritize and make these kind of decisions. Our work order, a lot of our choices that we make now are on past work order history. So the costs that we assign to buildings are based on the past 3 to 5 years of work orders that have physically occurred on that. So it's sort of a lagging model that tells us, hey, this building was expensive. It's going to be more expensive going into the future. But with this citywide audit, that's going to allow us to have a lot more hard data and where these critical systems are in their life.
Okay. Going to there was a number 977, the facilities management. And I'm sorry, that was the recommended adjustment. What was the explanation for that? This is on the revenues by fund.
Yeah, Councilmember Dominguez. The increase was the $1.2 million in Measure C funding. And the delta there was a couple $100,000 due to we reduced our allocated charges in FY19 for a couple reasons. The Cabrillo Pavilion is not online because they're doing a large construction project there, so we gave parks a break. We're not in there maintaining. We're not providing custodial services, so facilities revenue was decreased. And the same goes for Goleta Library. For building maintenance fees and custodial services was about $120,000 that we're no longer receiving because Goleta Library is no longer under our control.
Okay. And the streets fund, you show the $17 million from Measure C. What's the total revenue we're expecting from Measure C?
18. Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of council, Councilmember Dominguez. For the streets fund, it's 17.3.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on this section? Mr. Casey, any public comment slips? Okay. Any other questions? I have a couple. I forgot to ask about sidewalks. And how do you balance it when there's places where there's no sidewalks? And then I see references to repairing sidewalks. And so maybe if there's a lot of traffic, foot traffic, then you need to repair. But how do you do that when there's places where there's no sidewalk at all?
Madam Mayor, this is Jim Dewey again. Our program takes care of capital maintenance. So, as far as Measure C funding and some of our other capital funding, within our program, we're going to be focusing on replacing sidewalks that are bad or deteriorated. As far as sidewalk infill is concerned, those would be generally grant funded. So we haven't contributed, any, we haven't planned to have any Measure C funds spent for the purposes of sidewalk infill at this point.
Okay, Ms. Bjork.
Madam Mayor, I just want to modify that slightly, with the exception that we are aware there's some really small gaps around, like half a block here, half a block there, that just don't make sense, and we will be seeking to fill in those gaps. Places where it's, a lot of the places there aren't sidewalks because they're very expensive to install because they require retaining walls or other infrastructure beyond just the sidewalk. But the places where they're relatively inexpensive to install, we will certainly be putting on our radar and looking at a way to get them installed.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Demore, how is it working that we've changed the surveying function from the city? Right, we used to have surveyors, and we letting the county do some of that. How is that working out, sir?
Madam Mayor, so a couple of questions in there, I guess, on the using the county. That we mutually agreed that worked great for the time that we needed it, but we're no longer utilizing their services for some of the subdivision map act review. We actually have a consultant on board as needed to do that, and that's working out great. Just in general with survey, we have a couple of local surveyors who are on-call contracts, and as needed, when things come up for our capital projects, we're able to deploy them and get the surveys that we need. So that is working out.
And we're retaining records, right, that we've had for a really long time. That's what I'm remembering.
That is correct, yes. We're looking to move some of those records from the old survey office to the engineering vault, which is on the Garden Street property.
Very good. Mr. Dominguez, your light's on? Is it just, okay, go ahead.
So we moved in past the public comment phase, or we're kind of wrapping up here?
Yes, this is the wrap up. Yes.
Okay. I wanted to find out, so I mentioned there was a lot of new P3s, which is great. Is it possible to get the projected 2018 numbers for these? I'm assuming you use those to come up with the 2019 proposed. Is that the case?
Madam Mayor, members of council, and Councilmember Dominguez, you're saying, looking, for example, at this table here, you're saying at the FY18, so looking at the performance objectives, where those numbers came from?
No, in the budget, where you have the 3 columns: adopted fiscal year 18, projected fiscal year 18, and then proposed, the yellow and green columns.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, it would depend P3 by P3. So some of them, we have an idea of what we think those are going to be based on past experience, and that's where we would have put the objective in. Some of them, especially the other performance measures, are just, we don't have an idea. We've put in a number of what we think it might be. Those are generally things that are not within our control, which is why there are other performance measures. And we're really tracking those just as a way of tracking a measure of workload.
So I was thinking about things like number of linear feet of storm pipe replaced, number of drains fully serviced.
So on those two, I know Mr. Dewey is here, has some information on the drains, but we have, as was indicated, we have not been doing any pipeline replacement historically, so that's a projection for what we're expecting to get done.
And then the P3 regarding traffic concerns reported, it was 300, and then it drops to 200, and then the P3 says we're only solving 65% of those. Why are we only attempting to solve 65% of those?
Madam Mayor, can I use this microphone?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, good afternoon. My name is Derek Bailey with the Public Works Department. As far as the number of traffic concerns reported, we had a change in the number about a year ago. We moved the on-street parking related concerns out of our group into the downtown parking division. So they're now looking after on-street parking. So that represents the annual change. As far as the 65%, that's more of a measure of how quickly we're getting to things. Everything is addressed eventually. It's just some things get addressed quicker. So the measure is 65%, I believe, within 60 calendar days. 60 calendar days. So it's a measurement of how quickly we're able to respond to the public.
And that's just getting them an email or phone call, or getting them a memo, or what exactly triggers success at that point?
That's resolution. So we respond quickly when somebody contacts us. We at least let them know we're working on it. But as far as getting that to resolution, that's what that measures.
So when it says for investigations completed this quarter or resolved in this quarter, is that just from something you had that was more of a quarterly basis, not a fiscal year P3? Or what's the quarter relationship here?
So for the traffic concerns reported that were resolved that quarter, that's how long it's taking us. So this is saying, did we resolve 65% of those concerns completed in that quarter on time? Okay. And how do we reconcile this with Vision Zero? Are there some P3s? I know you show annual number of involved collisions. So bicycle involved collisions, we had 60 or projected 65 for this fiscal year, and we're looking at 70 for next year. Seems like that's going in the wrong direction. This is on D111. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, and backing up to actually a question you asked about a year ago regarding the flow of information between Public Works and the Police Department and collision reporting. Within the last 6 months or so, we've actually are getting much more real-time collision data from the Police Department. In the old way of doing things, we had to rely on the flow of collision data from our Police Department to the California Highway Patrol. It got entered into a database, which we then downloaded and were able to use the data. That whole process took about 18 months. So the data that we had available to us was generally at a minimum 18 months old. Now that information is flowing directly between the Police Department and the Public Works Department. Excuse me. So the data we have is sometimes just a few weeks old, so we can respond to things much more quickly. The P3s that we have listed on here are actually a reflection of much more real-time data than we've had in the past. So for example, a few years ago, the actual number of bicycle-involved collisions in fiscal year 17 was 97. This past year, we saw a downward trend. Our goal for fiscal year 19 is 70. So the change is actually based on more real-time data.
So is the 65 that's projected no longer accurate based on the new data sources we have?
That's correct.
And it's going to be above 90? Or that was 2017
that was 2017. So we are
projection?
Trending downward. The new projection is 70 for next year.
Okay. And is there anything we can do to start ratcheting these down?
Well, the most immediate thing that can be done is police enforcement. Changes to the street network take time. We do have a number of really big, exciting projects in the works. The Las Positas pathway certainly is a big one, but much closer to downtown where a lot of the collisions are concentrated, the east side and the west side bike boulevard projects. Those will be implemented in 2021. There's the State Street Green Lane bike lane project, which is probably going to happen in the summer of 2019 in conjunction with some paving work. So just in terms of what can be done engineering-wise, we do have some really great projects in the works. It's just that they do take a longer time to implement. The most immediate thing that can be done is police enforcement.
And how is it you share information with PD in terms of where the hot spots are or could be?
We meet pretty regularly with the police department. They do have their own program that they get grant funding from the Governor's Office of Traffic Safety. That's where you see a lot of the spot enforcement and the targeted enforcement efforts that they do. But in terms of the more systemic problems that we're having, where are problems having, what are some of the engineering solutions that we can implement, we talk to them pretty regularly and bounce ideas off of each other. So that's a constant work that we have with them.
Okay, great. And I was at Franklin Elementary, this school, and there had been an accident in front of the school recently. A 3-year-old was hit, and I know you guys have been getting complaints about people coming down the cross streets to Milpas and APS, and I know that's been a traditional source of problems and collisions in particular. So aside from police enforcement, is there anything we're working on? Is the Alisos bike path in the queue somewhere in the near future, or what other projects?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, the Alisos Bike Boulevard project is planned to be implemented in year 2021. That project is going to create a free-flowing bike facility on Alisos from Cacique all the way up to Canon Perdido, kind of paralleling Milpa Street. And the idea being we really want to provide an efficient street for cyclists to be on so they can get off of Milpa Street. So that's going to mean that all the stop signs that are on Alisos are going to get swapped so that they'll be facing all of the cross streets that come down from the Riviera and from Milpa Street rather than stopping Alisos Street. We're very concerned about stop sign compliance by doing that. So it's not as easy as just flipping the stop signs and expecting to get good results. We are going to have to build some islands and some other things to make the stop really reinforce what needs to happen there. The Alisos Bike Boulevard and introducing those additional stops is likely going to address a lot of the concerns that Eastside residents have. But because it's not as easy as just flipping the stop signs, it is something that's going to take a few years to implement.
And one of the things I've noticed is some of the crosswalks are a little faded, and that's something that will help people know there's an intersection, particularly now that there's more cars, bigger SUVs and van type vehicles. So maybe that's something, I think that you guys are putting out a plan for more repainting. So,
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, because of Measure C, we'll have more funding available to do restriping this year, and we're going to be repainting everything on the mountainside and the east of State Street this year, and everything on the other side of State Street will happen next year. So there's going to be a lot of repainting happening in the near future.
Okay, great. The I guess the broader point I want to make with this is when we're prioritizing money, and I know Mr. Casey, you pointed out that we have to keep within our budget when we're deciding which departments or where within departments we're spending things like this, which are health and life safety related. It's important that council gets information that helps us prioritize that if that's something that the department thinks they can quantify. We are getting a big infusion with Measure C. This budget today gave us a lot of data, a lot of quantity, but it's hard to guess what's behind the data in terms of what are some of the projects that the department's pushing and why. You're giving us the numbers, but there's not a sense of the vision or the spirit behind that. So that would help. And I know today is just a snippet. We're going to get 2 more snippets with the Finance Committee and Measure C. But then also within the budget, I'd like to know what areas we're doing well in, because I think we should reward departments and areas within departments that are making the best use of their funds. And we don't necessarily see this unless it's in the P3s. So to the extent we can get that picture from the P3s, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Bailey. It's not a Public Works hearing without hearing from you, so thanks. So that concludes our presentation. The next budget hearing is Thursday, May 24th, starting at 2 p.m., and that's our fire department and police department. Anything to add, Mr. Casey?
I just want to say you're about halfway through on your budget hearings. So you've got Thursday, March 24th, police and fire. You have Thursday, May 31st at 9 in the morning, library and community development. And then you have Monday, June 4th at 2:30. You'll have finance, admin services, city attorney, city administrator, and Measure C capital at the full council. And then Wednesday evening, June 6th at 6 p.m. is your final budget direction to staff to prepare the final budget for any changes you want to make.
Very good. Ms. Bjork, congratulations to your staff, doing a great job. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.